A group of boys are playing in the courtyard of Jerusalem. They shove each other, they scratch, they try to prove who is stronger. But one boy never reacts, not when they twist his arm, not when they dig their nails into his skin. At first they think he is brave, but his tutor soon understands something terrifying. A child who cannot feel pain is a child whose body is already dying. The diagnosis spreads quietly through the court. Leprosy, a disease feared across the medieval world. It destroys the nerves, the flesh, the face, slowly, without mercy. For most men it meant exile. For Baldwin, it meant becoming king. The kingdom of Jerusalem was never strong, a small crusader state surrounded by enemies, and now its king was a dying teenager. Across the desert, a new power was rising. His name was Saladin, a commander who had united Egypt and Syria, a man with one clear goal: to erase the crusader kingdoms forever. And against him stood a king whose body was already collapsing. In the year 1177, Saladin invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem. His army was massive, thousands of soldiers, veteran commanders, a force that expected an easy victory, because the enemy was led by a dying boy. But Baldwin refused to hide behind the walls of Jerusalem. Every advisor told him to remain behind the walls, to send another man to fight. Any reasonable king would have done exactly that. But Baldwin understood something about armies. Men do not fight for orders, they fight for symbols, and nothing is stronger than a king who refuses to hide. Before the army marched, they raised the most sacred relic of their world, the true cross. To the soldiers of Jerusalem, it meant God stood with them. To Saladin's army, it meant these men would not run. Near the hill of Montgisard, the impossible happened. Baldwin attacked. His smaller army crashed into Saladin's forces with sudden fury. The Muslim army had not expected resistance. Their lines were scattered, and the crusader charge broke through like a storm. At the center of the charge rode a king whose body could barely hold him upright, a king who could barely feel his own hands. But the soldiers saw him, and in that moment they believed victory was possible. Saladin's army collapsed. Men fled across the desert. The greatest commander of the Muslim world barely escaped alive. It was the most devastating defeat of his career, delivered by a dying king. But disease does not negotiate. The nerves in Baldwin's body continued to fail. His sight faded. Walking became impossible. The king who once rode into battle could no longer mount a horse. Years later, Saladin returned, this time to the fortress of Kerak. Inside the castle, a wedding celebration had turned into a siege, and Baldwin could barely move. Most kings in such condition would remain behind the walls. But Baldwin ordered something extraordinary. If he could not ride, he would be carried. A dying king leading his army from a litter. When Saladin learned that Baldwin himself had arrived, he lifted the siege. Even dying, the king's presence was enough. Baldwin IV died in the year 1185. Still young, still fighting until the end. Without him, the fragile unity of Jerusalem collapsed. Within a few years, Saladin would capture the city. But history remembers Baldwin for something else. Not because he lived long, but because he refused to surrender. And for a brief moment in history, a dying king stood between Jerusalem and destruction and held the line. Subscribe and write in the comments, which historical figure do you want to see next?